A writer's fiction turned fatal, each chapter closer to a real corpse. Welcome to Sherlock Mystery. I'm your host, Thornby. Tell me, where are you solving this case from? Drop it in the comments. Your presence always adds depth to the mystery. Let's begin. It was on a grey Tuesday in early October when the air of Baker Street turned peculiarly thick. Not with fog, though that would come soon enough, but with an unease that not even the cheerful crackle of the hearth could fully dispel. I had just returned from my morning rounds and was settling into my armchair when Holmes, with his usual disregard for pleasantries, flung open the Morning Post with the precision of a surgeon and the flair of a stage magician. Without looking up, he murmured, "Prepare yourself for something singular, Watson. The postman has delivered not a letter, but a mystery." He held aloft a brown parcel, plain save for the handwriting, which even from where I sat, struck me as unusually neat, almost obsessively so. Holmes slit it open with his letter opener, revealing a manuscript of some 40 pages, bound in twine and accompanied by a single note. He read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, this manuscript contains a murder not yet committed. If I am correct, someone will die within the week, precisely as described, a watcher of shadows." Holmes' eyes gleamed, and for a brief second, his entire posture changed, as if an invisible current had passed through him. "A delicious premise," he said, handing me the note while he began thumbing through the pages. "And quite possibly a lunatic's ramblings." I leaned forward, studying the first page. "Is it fiction or a confession?" Holmes tapped his forefinger to his lips. "Neither, I suspect. The prose is florid, but the details— Listen to this. At exactly 6 minutes past the hour of 10, the Reverend Silas Pendlebury will fall backward onto the pulpit floor of St. Augustine's in Mayfair, crimson blooming upon his vestments, the dagger having found its mark beneath the fourth rib." "A very specific fantasy," I muttered. "Yes, too specific," Holmes said, setting down the manuscript and turning toward the fire, hands laced behind his back. "St. Augustine's, you say? I believe the rector there is indeed Reverend Silas Pendlebury, a tepid sermonizer, as I recall, harmless, devout, entirely forgettable." The gravity in Holmes's tone shifted. I could see it now. The machinery of his mind had already begun to turn. "Watson, we must ascertain whether the good Reverend is alive." We were in a cab within the quarter hour, Holmes having summoned it with an energy I had not seen in days. As the carriage jolted through the soot-streaked streets, Holmes sat silently, fingers steepled, eyes unfocused, as though watching the scenes of the murder play out already in his head. St. Augustine's church emerged from the fog like a slumbering colossus, its narrow Gothic windows glazed with autumn dew. Inside, the pews were mostly empty, save for 2 elderly parishioners and a young curate polishing brass. Holmes approached the pulpit and scanned the area with exacting precision. First the floor, then the railings, then the altar cloth. I noted nothing unusual myself, but Holmes frowned. "Excuse me," he said sharply to the curate. "Reverend Pendlebury. Is he well?" The young man blinked. "The Reverend? Why, yes, sir. He's in the rectory now, I believe. Shall I fetch him?" "Immediately." Moments later, Reverend Pendlebury, a small, tired-looking man in spectacles, emerged with a mild start. Holmes greeted him with a kind of brisk severity. "Reverend, I must ask, have you received any threats recently? Unusual letters? Visitors out of place?" The man's eyes widened behind his thick lenses. "Heavens, no. Is something the matter?" Holmes produced the manuscript and held it beneath the man's gaze. "Are you aware you have been cast in the role of murder victim in this script?" Pendlebury paled, taking a trembling step backward. I don't understand. Who would write such a thing?" "That is precisely what I intend to discover," Holmes said coolly. Outside, the fog had thickened into a low curtain, and Holmes's expression matched it. "This is no idle jest, Watson. The phrasing is too practiced. The scene, too accurately depicted. We must treat it as a credible threat. But surely, Holmes, no criminal would announce their crime beforehand. Holmes turned his piercing gaze on me. And yet, someone has. The question is, why? Is this a warning, a game, or a rehearsal? Back at Baker Street, we resumed our study of the manuscript. It was written in the third person, its narrator describing events with a detached omniscience that lent the scenes a chilling inevitability. And it was not only the murder of Pendlebury described. Holmes read aloud a second passage. A widow shall find herself weeping not for her husband, but for her son, whose body will be pulled from the Serpentine wrapped in painter's cloth. She will scream once, not twice. I looked at Holmes sharply. This implies multiple murders. Indeed, it is not a murder. It is a schedule. A silence fell between us then, heavy, measured. Holmes tapped the edge of the manuscript as if it were a metronome. "Watson," he said at last, "we must treat this manuscript not as a narrative, but as prophecy, a constructed timeline authored by someone with knowledge, motive, and, most disturbingly, the will to see it through." He leaned forward, eyes glittering with dark excitement. "I believe, Watson, that we are not merely solving a murder, we are racing it." By the time the gas lamps flickered to life across London's mist-veiled streets that evening, Holmes had already compiled a full transcription of the manuscript. He sat cross-legged on the rug of our Baker Street sitting room, his long fingers tracing the lines like a blind man reading Braille. I had read the text twice myself and still could not make sense of its rhythm, if rhythm it had. The stories were disjointed, prophetic in tone, and oddly specific. Yet, if there was logic behind them, it lay buried. Holmes did not speak for nearly half an hour. Then, as the coals settled in the grate, he said, "Watson, the murders are not listed randomly. They follow a pattern, chronological, yes, but not merely in time. There is a symbolic arc here, a narrative architecture meant not just to inform, but to impress." I leaned forward. "You believe the author to be staging murders for theatrical effect?" "Precisely. The manuscript mimics the structure of a tragedy, a prologue, a rising action, a climax to come. The murder of Reverend Pendlebury is merely the curtain raiser." I exhaled slowly. "That implies we have only days before the second act." Holmes nodded. "And the widow whose son is found in the Serpentine, she's introduced next. I've already sent a telegram to Inspector Lestrade, requesting discreet surveillance at the Pendlebury Rectory and the area around Hyde Park. But we must move more swiftly than the author." He stood, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and crossed to the mantelpiece where his index of obscure London residents was stacked in battered folios. "You recall the widow described?" he asked, already pulling volumes free. I nodded. "Weeping not for her husband, but for her son. Painter's cloth, the Serpentine." That's what the passage said. Exactly. Now consider the specificity of painter's cloth. That's not simply poetic. It's personal. Someone is choosing victims tied by threads unseen to us, but not to him. Holmes found what he sought in a slim leather volume labeled South Kensington Art and Letters. He ran his finger down the entries. "Ah," he murmured. "Here she is. Mrs. Heloise Brant, widow of Frederick Brant, noted portraitist. Died last year. Son, Louis Brant, age 22, still living at home. An amateur artist himself. Exhibited briefly at the Grosvenor last spring." "That fits," I said, "and South Kensington is only a short distance from the Serpentine." Holmes closed the folio with a snap. "We must go tonight." Despite the hour, Mrs. Brant received us with grace, if with a certain guardedness. She was a refined woman, sharp of cheek and voice, dressed in a morning gown that seemed to fit her as naturally as her own bones. The parlor was dimly lit, dominated by portraits, her late husband's work, presumably, and one large canvas that remained draped in a pale cloth undisturbed in the corner. Holmes bowed slightly. Madam, I apologize for the abrupt visit, but I must ask, is your son at home? Mrs. Brandt's eyes narrowed. Louis? No, he went out this afternoon and has not returned. Why do you ask? Holmes exchanged a glance with me before turning back to her. Madame, has your son ever spoken of fears for his safety? Of strange letters? Anonymous threats? Her spine stiffened. I beg your pardon. What is this about? Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the typed excerpt he had copied from the manuscript. He handed it to her with a gravity I had seen only in the gravest cases. As her eyes scanned the words, her face lost all color. No, she whispered. No, this is some cruel jest. I fear it is not, Holmes said gently. We believe your son may be in danger. Do you know where he was going today? Mrs. Brandt clasped the back of a chair. He mentioned an art supply shop. Waterford's in Soho, but that was hours ago. Holmes turned on his heel. We must go, Watson. Time is against us. We arrived at Waterford's 20 minutes later. The streets nearly empty now, save for the occasional omnibus or late errand runner. The clerk, a sleepy-eyed youth, remembered Louis Brandt clearly. He bought oil paints and canvas. Left not long after 5. Alone? Holmes asked. Yes, sir. But he said he was heading toward the park to sketch the water. The words chilled me. The Serpentine. Holmes was already out the door. We dashed through Hyde Park, the grass slick with dew, the fog thickening with each step. Our lanterns cut narrow cones through the murk. Somewhere, a nightbird screeched. Then, there, Holmes shouted. We sprinted toward the bank of the Serpentine. A figure lay crumpled at the edge of the water, partially covered by a length of pale painter's cloth. It was Louis Brandt. He was alive, barely. Blood stained his shirt near the shoulder, and his breathing was shallow. Holmes knelt, checking the pulse. Not fatal, he said. A knife wound. Deep but deliberate. Watson, can you manage? I nodded, already tearing strips from my sleeve for a makeshift bandage. Holmes stood and scanned the surrounding fog, then turned back toward the path. Whoever attacked him meant to wound, not kill. This was theatrical. A warning, or worse, an announcement. We carried Louis to the nearest constable station, where arrangements were made for his hospitalization. He drifted in and out of consciousness, but managed to mutter one phrase clearly before losing full awareness. He said, I was next. The next scene. Back at Baker Street hours later, Holmes stood before the manuscript once more. He's watching us, Watson, he said softly. Whoever wrote this, he knows we're following. He wants us to, and now he's changed the script. He turned toward the fireplace, where the last page of the manuscript now lay open. He's not just predicting murder anymore, Holmes said grimly. He's performing it. The flames crackled, and outside the window, the fog thickened once more. By mid-morning the next day, London's grey skies had congealed into a flat leaden dome overhead, pressing down upon the city like a weight. The manuscript, now laid out upon Holmes's desk and secured at the corners with chess pieces, bore a new significance. No longer dismissed as eccentric nonsense, it had transformed, by blood and coincidence, into a criminal road map. Holmes stood before the window, his pipe unlit in his hand, unusually silent. I could hear the quiet tap of his fingers against the sill. When he turned, his expression had the distant focus I had come to recognize as the prelude to action. Watson, he said, we now possess 2 facts and 1 shadow. First, the predictions have begun to materialize. Pendlebury nearly murdered. Brandt attacked precisely as described. Second, the assailant is not content to wait for opportunity. He manufactures it. And the shadow? The identity of the author, of course. But I am growing increasingly convinced that he walks among us in daylight. I was preparing to respond when Mrs. Hudson knocked unlocked and entered with a telegram. Holmes took it, tore it open, and scanned its contents. "From Lestrade," he murmured. "Pendlebury has received a second message, an envelope containing a single page from the same manuscript, identical handwriting. It states only, 'Your sermon has been rewritten. Sunday shall end in silence.'" I frowned. That implies he still intends to strike. Holmes nodded. "Yes, but now we are alerted, and so he must improvise. He will not risk another failure." He tapped the edge of the telegram against his palm. "We go to Scotland Yard. Bring the manuscript. I must speak with Lestrade and, more importantly, examine this new note. There may be a flaw in the rhythm, a slip in the tone. No one can forge style without risking betrayal by detail." The journey to the yard was conducted in clipped silence. Holmes's thoughts were evidently in furious motion. At the yard, Inspector Lestrade met us with his usual blend of condescension and reluctant curiosity. He led us to his office, where the second note was waiting under glass. Holmes donned a lens and examined it closely. "Same ink, same pen. But observe here, Watson," he said, pointing to the flourished S in Sunday. "Slightly different tilt. The pressure lightens halfway through. This was written hastily." He shifted to the envelope. "No postmark, hand-delivered, which means the writer is either someone who frequents the church or has access to its inner spaces." Lestrade folded his arms. "We've already questioned the staff. No strangers, no unusual activity. Reverend's been under watch since your first warning." Holmes offered a tight smile. "And yet the note was delivered, was it not? No doubt left quietly among the vestry papers, or slipped through the rectory door. You are watching too visibly, Lestrade. Our man operates like a stagehand. He thrives in the wings." Holmes turned sharply. "I want access to the parish records. Every lay contributor, every local donor, every former choir boy turned scholar. Someone has a vendetta dressed up in drama." The records were musty and exhaustive. For the better part of 2 hours, Holmes flipped through attendance rolls, donations, and staff turnover logs. Then he stopped. "Here. Malcolm Dreve." Lestrade raised a brow. "And who's he?" Holmes tapped the margin. "Choir master's apprentice until last year. Dismissed for disruptive influence. No further detail. I make it a point, Lestrade, to investigate dismissals without explanations." We traced Dreve to a boarding house in Brixton. Holmes's deduction that a disgraced church employee might end up in cheaper lodgings proved correct. The landlady, a thin woman who reeked of mothballs and vinegar, confirmed he still resided there. "He comes and goes at odd hours," she said, squinting through the cracked door. "Talks to himself, keeps notebooks, all sorts of scribbling." Holmes flashed her a courteous smile. "Would you mind if we waited inside his room?" The room was small and dark, cluttered with worn books, oil paints, and sketches of cathedral interiors. What arrested our attention immediately, however, was the desk. On it lay a sheaf of loose papers, handwritten in the same distinctive, immaculate script as the manuscript. Holmes skimmed the first sheet, and his expression darkened. "Watson," he said, holding up a page, "this is a draft of the next scene." I stepped forward, and my eyes caught the line near the top. "He will descend the library stairs, not knowing the book he seeks has already been marked. At 10:15, beneath the gaze of silent busts, he will collapse." Holmes flipped to another sheet. "And here, a plan of the Westminster Gentlemen's Club library." He turned toward me, his face pale but composed. "He's chosen the next victim. A clubman. Likely someone who expelled or insulted him. And the time, 10:15 tonight." I checked my watch. It was just past 6. Holmes moved quickly now, issuing instructions. Lestrade would post men at all library entrances. Holmes and I would enter the club as visitors, he posing as a member's guest, myself as his physician. By 9:45, we were seated in the club's vast library, a vaulted chamber lined with ancient volumes and Greek busts gazing down like stone judges. Members passed quietly between rows of shelves or rested in heavy leather chairs, the atmosphere thick with pipe smoke and scholarly silence. Holmes did not speak. He simply watched the stairs. At precisely 10:12, a tall gentleman in evening wear entered from above. Lord Haversley, as Holmes later whispered. He made his way to the philosophy section. 10:14. A figure moved in the shadows near the stairwell. Holmes was up in a flash. "No sudden movement," he barked, striding across the marble floor. The figure, a young man in a grey coat, froze. "Malcolm Dreve, I presume," Holmes said coldly. "Murder thrives in timing, but you mistimed your entrance." The man made a sudden movement toward his coat pocket, but Lestrade's men were already upon him. A knife was recovered, its blade sheathed in fresh wax to delay its detection. Holmes approached him. "Why the manuscript, Mr. Dreve?" The man's face contorted with something between pride and resentment. "Because they didn't listen," he said. "The church, the club?" They laughed. "So I wrote it. Every scene, every silence. I wanted the city to read what it ignored." Holmes studied him for a long moment. "You turned grievance into literature and murder into authorship. An artist of crime." As Dreve was led away, Holmes turned to me. "He gave us the script, Watson," he said, his voice heavy. "But in the end, he couldn't rewrite fate." The library remained silent, its busts, as ever, unmoved. The arrest of Malcolm Dreve was met with no great stir in the newspapers. Confined to a column buried deep within the Evening Standard, labeled merely "Attempted Assault in Club Library, Foiled by Detectives." There was no mention of manuscripts, no mention of prophecy or design, just as Holmes had intended. "Let him remain a footnote," Holmes remarked the next morning over a tepid cup of tea. "His theatre demands an audience. We deny him one by refusing the curtain call." I was not quite so satisfied. Dreve's expression as he was led from the club, half smug, half disappointed, still lingered with me. "And yet," I said slowly, "his work did not end with his arrest. He had more scenes drafted. The manuscript described events days ahead. Surely he couldn't have expected to carry them all out alone." Holmes looked up sharply. "Precisely, Watson, and that, I believe, is where our investigation truly begins." He crossed the room, retrieving a small pile of folded notes Lestrade had delivered earlier that morning. Dreve's belongings are revealing, but not conclusive. Among his effects was a short letter, unsigned, addressed to him in familiar tone. And this... Holmes lifted a fragment of paper, no larger than a calling card. A list of dates and initials, none of them his. He handed it to me. October 7th, RP, October 10th, HB, October 13th, AC. These must be future victims. Possibly. But more importantly, we must determine who these initials belong to and how Dreve came by them. He was no clairvoyant. Someone fed him names, Watson. An accomplice? Holmes's brow furrowed, his tone low. Or a director? We set out shortly after noon, calling first upon Scotland Yard to speak again with Lestrade. Holmes laid the list before him. "These initials. Have your men found anything corresponding in Dreve's address book or notebooks?" Lestrade scratched his temple. There was a mention of RP in a margin. Beside it the word arrival, nothing more. We assumed it meant a visitor or a train time. Holmes tapped the card. "It is more. He was coordinating with someone who supplied both targets and theatrical direction. Dreve was merely the vessel." Lestrade frowned. "Then who is the playwright?" That question remained with us as we left the yard. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet as we returned to Baker Street. Once there, he fetched the original manuscript and sat again with it, but this time his eyes focused not on the prose, but the structure. "Watson," Do you recall the passage about Lord Haversley? Yes. He will descend the library stairs, not knowing the book he seeks has already been marked. Exactly. That was not merely vivid detail. That was insider knowledge. The library in question. Did you observe it? The shelves were labeled by genre, but the books were placed in reverse order, left to right rather than right to left. Obscure, even to most members. But Dreve described the positioning as if he had stood there. He hadn't. How can you be sure? Because he would have said so. His vanity was considerable. No, Watson. Someone else wrote the original draft. Dreve merely rehearsed it. The revelation was unsettling. If there was another author, one still free, then the danger had not ended with Dreve's arrest. It had, in fact, evolved. That evening, as we reviewed the list of potential RPs in the club and university registers, a new telegram arrived. Holmes read it once and went still. Watson, come. A man named Reginald Potter, clerk to the Treasury and occasional contributor to the London Historical Review, has been found dead in his study. Police believe it was a fall. He struck his temple on the fireplace. But there was a folded sheet of paper beside his hand. I stood. Was it? Holmes nodded. A page from the manuscript. Newly written, describing his final steps as if witnessed from within the room. We arrived at the Potter residence in Westminster by gaslight, met by a constable who escorted us inside. The study was small, its hearth cold, but the room untouched since discovery. Holmes knelt and examined the carpet, brushing at a smear of blood and coal dust. No sign of forced entry, he murmured. And yet the lamp was moved. See the square impression of dust here, Watson. It once stood to the left of the fireplace. Now it's closer to the door. It was used to obscure a clear line of sight. He moved to the desk. There lay the manuscript page. Potter, distracted by the errant spark from the hearth, bends to retrieve a fallen matchbook. He does not see the shadow that shifts behind him, nor feel the gloved hand that guides his fall. He meets the stone with no sound but the sigh of wind against glass. Holmes's mouth tightened. This was no accident. I turned. The shadow in the narrative. Was it Dreve? Holmes shook his head. Unlikely. Dreve was in custody when this was written. We're chasing a ghost, Watson. A ghost with perfect clarity of timing. He paced the small room, absorbing the space. Then, as if struck by something unseen, he halted. Did you notice the handwriting? He asked suddenly. Yes, I said. It matched the previous entries. But not precisely, Holmes replied. This hand is more elegant, more mature. The loops are tighter, the crossbars surer. This is the original hand, Watson. We have found the true author. Then Dreve was merely the actor. Someone has cast these scenes from a distance, and now, with Dreve removed, he has resumed the stage. We left the Potter house with urgency. The initials on the card had become a grim countdown. Next was H.B., only 2 days hence. Back at Baker Street, Holmes stared into the fire. There is something theatrical about the signature, he said. These initials are not drawn from randomness. They are pulled from history, from personal insult, perhaps even from a rejected readership. He looked at me, eyes sharp. Watson, how does one send their grievances into the world when the world won't read them? I blinked. They self-publish? Or, Holmes said, rising, they hide their venom inside fiction and send it directly to those they despise. He crossed to his desk and opened a drawer. Tomorrow we visit the London Historical Review. If our playwright published anonymously, there will be letters, manuscripts, even rejections. He looked at me then, not with excitement, but with the cool fire of pursuit. We are not chasing a murderer, Watson. We are hunting an author who believes death itself is art. We arrived at the offices of the London Historical Review just past 9 the following morning. the fog outside still heavy enough to turn gaslight into a vague, watery glow. The building itself, a converted Georgian townhouse near Fleet Street, bore the quiet austerity of a place accustomed to scholarly obscurity. Leaden windows, brass nameplates, the faint scent of aging paper and ink. Holmes announced our presence with a business card and a quiet demand for their editorial correspondence records, particularly those concerning a Mr. Malcolm Dreve and any other unsolicited literary submissions of anonymous or pseudonymous nature from the last 18 months. The editor-in-chief, a spectacled man named Fenchurch, with a florid face and a defensive air, met us in the archives room. He was initially resistant, unaccustomed to police inquiries and even less accustomed to Holmes's implacable insistence. But a brief mention of the word murder softened his professional pride enough to grant access. Holmes sorted rapidly through boxes of letters, glancing only briefly at each envelope. "Watson," he said without looking up, "do keep your eyes open for anything signed a Watcher of Shadows, or failing that, any submission in typescript with no return address." The hours passed in rustling paper and ticking clocks. It was near noon when Holmes straightened, a single envelope in his hand. It was dated from 5 months earlier. There was no name on the front, only an initial A. He opened it carefully, revealing a cover letter and a typescript entitled The Measure of Silence. His eyes moved rapidly over the contents. "It's him," Holmes said softly. "Listen to this. The tragedy of London lies not in its noise, but its quiet. Each alley, each windowed room is a stage, and the actors wear masks of civility. Remove those masks, and one finds a kind of perfect, unspoken violence beneath the surface." The story that followed bore uncanny resemblance to the murders now being carried out. A reverend silenced mid-sermon, an artist drowned in a lake wrapped in muslin, a scholar struck dead in his library. All under different names, but the structure, the atmosphere, the fatal flourish of each scene. It was the same manuscript in another skin. Holmes's voice was low. This was not merely an anonymous submission. This was a rehearsal draft. Fenchurch, now leaning in curiously, frowned. We rejected that piece. Too elaborate. The prose was excellent, but the concept seemed grotesque. I recall writing a personal reply, though I never received one in return. "Do you still have that reply?" Holmes asked. Fenchurch disappeared momentarily, returning with a carbon copy on onion skin paper. Holmes read it in silence, then smiled, not with triumph, but with satisfaction. "Here is the insult," he murmured, "the very thing that turned a failed author into a killer. Listen to this. Your technical skill is not in question. However, your vision is unrelentingly morbid. Fiction must reveal truth, not obsess over cruelty. We suggest you refine your talents toward less indulgent aims." Holmes looked up. He would have loathed that. A man of wounded pride and obsession does not forgive dismissal, especially not when it strikes at the very heart of his self-conception. We left the offices shortly thereafter, the air outside now thinning slightly as the sun threatened to burn through the fog. Holmes tucked the envelope beneath his coat. "I now understand the logic of the murders, Watson. Each victim was selected not at random, but as a rebuke to those who dismissed him. Reverend Pendlebury wrote a sermon critiquing modern dramatic affectation in religious writing. He was quoted in a parish pamphlet I found last night. Reginald Potter was a reviewer who wrote a blistering essay on anonymous submissions, calling them cowardly. And now, this editor. Then HB is Hugh Bellingham," Holmes answered before I finished. "Drama critic for the Westminster Weekly. I found an early draft of his column in Dreve's flat. He wrote a particularly savage review of an underground play performed last autumn at the Savile Club, a play which I now strongly suspect was penned by our elusive killer." We arrived at Bellingham's flat in Kensington by 2 o'clock. Holmes knocked with quiet urgency. A servant answered and led us through a narrow corridor to the study, where Bellingham, a thin man in his 40s with a skeptical expression and an ink-stained cuff, greeted us with visible irritation. Holmes did not mince words. "Mr. Bellingham, you are in immediate danger. A man whose work you reviewed anonymously has begun killing his critics according to a pre-written manuscript. We believe you are named in it." To his credit, Bellingham's reaction was more incredulity than panic. "You're suggesting a dramatist is hunting down reviewers," he said with a thin smile. "That would make half the city a suspect." "Not just any dramatist," Holmes replied. "One who operates under the pseudonym A Watcher of Shadows. Do you recall reviewing such a work?" Bellingham blinked once. Then again. Yes, there was a play. Strange thing. Obscure. Titled Dust in Glass. Very stylized. It was submitted to the club's private reading series. We read it, then refused to stage it. The author sent no name, only the pseudonym you mention. I critiqued it for its excessive theatrical morbidity and lack of human insight. "Where is the script now?" Holmes asked. Bellingham hesitated, then opened a drawer in his desk. "Here. I kept a copy. Not for its quality, I assure you, but because something in the prose struck me. It was the kind of writing that seemed convinced of its own genius." Holmes took it, scanned the first few pages, and stopped at the top of Scene 2. There it was again. The voice. Cold, detached, perfectly composed. He folded the pages and stood. "You will remain indoors. Lock your windows. Post a constable outside if necessary. We believe your death is planned for tomorrow at midnight. On stage." Bellingham blanched. "On stage?" "Indeed," Holmes said, pocketing the script. "We believe he intends to commit your murder during the final act of a new production, one which has not been publicly announced, but which he has rehearsed extensively, in private, with blood." That night Holmes worked late into the hours, rereading Dust in Glass beside the manuscript and the letter from the review. At last he exhaled, and without turning to me said, "Watson, I have it." "The name?" "Number something better. A flaw. One line, one word. Inserted repeatedly throughout all versions of the manuscript. It is not part of the style. It is a trace." He held up the original page, the one recovered beside Reginald Potter's body. "This word, attenuate. It appears in nearly every murder description, always slightly out of rhythm. It was not part of Dreve's vocabulary." He flipped to Dust in Glass. "There." And then the review rejection letter. "There." He turned to me, and for the first time that day, his voice bore the bite of certainty. "We are no longer hunting a ghost, Watson. We are hunting a man who has left his fingerprint in language." The morning after Holmes uncovered the linguistic fingerprint, a palpable urgency clung to the air in Baker Street. He had not slept, nor had he left the fireside. The word attenuate had pierced the mystery's veil, revealing, to his mind, the edge of a silhouette. I found him seated precisely where I had left him hours earlier, his gaze fixed not on the manuscript but on the fire, as though searching its flames for a face. "I've cross-referenced every published use of the word over the last 2 years, Holmes said without preamble as I entered with tea. "Not in the general lexicon, mind you. This is not merely about vocabulary, but rhythm. Repetition. The habit of a mind that prizes cadence above all." He pointed to a column of names scribbled on the back of an old envelope. "Each of these individuals has used the term attenuate in prose or correspondence within the last 18 months. But only one appears in connection with drama, criticism, and the underground theatre circuit." He tapped a name near the bottom, Arthur Crale. I frowned. "I don't recognize it." "Few do. He's a minor playwright. Barely staged, always unfunded, his works rejected repeatedly by clubs, reviews, and publishers alike. But in private, he's prolific. An editor at the Theatre Mercury described him as the most unread writer in London. And he matches the initials on the list, A.C. Precisely. Crail was born to obscurity and cultivated bitterness like a garden. He studied under a dramatic theorist at King's College and became enamored of form over feeling, obsessed with structure, pattern. He published a single essay 3 years ago titled The Purity of Murder in Tragedy. I paused, the words chilling me. And where is he now? Holmes already had the answer. Lodgings in Lambeth under the name Arthur Cresswell. He rents 2 rooms above a closed bookseller's. The proprietor said he rarely speaks, but receives letters constantly. As we set out, a low drizzle had begun to mist the city, rendering every surface slick and reflective. The streets of Lambeth, narrow and poor, echoed with the clatter of carts and the distant cry of hawkers. We found the shop boarded and shuttered, but the side alley led to a stairwell winding up to the 2nd floor. Holmes knocked once. No answer. He knocked again, sharper this time, and the door creaked open, unlatched. The flat was dim. The windows were half covered with dark muslin, and a heavy curtain divided the sitting room from the rear. Holmes stepped inside first, his hand slipping silently into his coat. I followed, and the scent struck me. Ink, wax, and something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with books. Not merely shelves, but stacks on the floor, on the desk, even atop a cracked pianoforte in the corner. And scattered among them were pages, loose, numbered, annotated in a sharp, elegant script. Some bore titles: The Elegy of Bone, The Audience of Silence, Scene 7, The Collapse. "This is his theatre," Holmes whispered, sifting through a heap of papers. "A shrine to the craft. And here, look, Watson." On a narrow table stood a miniature stage model, a wooden box open in front, with tiny chairs carved from cork. It was a mock-up of a theatre interior, complete with velvet curtains drawn back. Inside, a paper figure lay face down on the stage, a red blot inked across its chest. Holmes examined the sides of the box. "Labels," he said, running his finger along the back. "Each drawer marked with a scene. And here, Act 5, Bellingham." He opened the drawer. Inside was a folded paper and a small bottle of clear liquid. Holmes unfolded the note. "He shall fall not to blade, but to breath. The critic who silenced art shall himself be silenced. Inhalation becomes requiem." He turned to me grimly. "Poisoned air. He intends to release gas or vapor during a performance. A closed theatre, no ventilation, audience unaware." I felt my stomach twist. "But when? Where?" Holmes rifled through the other drawers, each labelled meticulously. At last he found what he needed, an envelope bearing a theatre name, the Ashcroft Hall. He read aloud. "Private staging, invitation only. Final curtain, October 10th, 9 p.m. That's tonight." There was no time to spare. We sent word to Lestrade en route, requesting plainclothes officers to arrive at the Ashcroft in time for the show. Holmes, meanwhile, acquired a theatre program through his network, confirming the event as an anonymous, modernist dramatic unveiling hosted by a shell group with no official registry. The Ashcroft itself stood like a forgotten temple among newer buildings, an aging Victorian hall with dusted chandeliers and faded red seats. When we arrived, ushers were distributing masks to the audience, part of the performance's supposed immersive intent. The lobby buzzed with fashionable murmurs and amateur critics, none suspecting the shadow that hovered just above their heads. Holmes donned his mask and entered quietly, scanning the room. "There," he murmured. "Upper balcony, behind the rigging. A figure in grey, stationary. Not a stagehand." We slipped behind the curtain and made our way to the upper level via the back stairwell. Holmes moved like smoke. No wasted sound, no glance astray. As we reached the balcony door, we could hear the orchestra beginning its eerie overture below. Inside, crouched over a pipe tucked into the ventilation shaft, was a man of lean build, his features obscured by a scarf and cap. He was preparing something, slowly pouring the contents of the small bottle we had seen in the drawer into a metal canister. Holmes sprang. The man turned, startled, but Holmes was faster. He struck the canister from the figure's hand, sending it clattering across the wooden floorboards. "Arthur Crail," Holmes said coldly, "your final act is cut from the program." Crail's eyes, grey and lifeless, did not flash with fear, only resignation. "They would have watched," he whispered. "Even if only to breathe their last, they would have finally watched." Holmes took no satisfaction in the arrest. Crail was led out silently, past rows of guests who never knew how close they had come to becoming part of a posthumous performance. That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes stood at the window, pipe untouched, eyes drawn to the fog that curled along the edges of lamplight. He mistook silence for indifference, he said at last, and when the world did not applaud, he forced it to listen in gasps. He turned to me, his voice low. "But art must never demand blood to be seen, Watson. No performance deserves a corpse as its finale." The days that followed Arthur Crail's arrest seemed to offer a certain respite, but Holmes remained restless, his mind not yet at ease. It was not simply the resolution of the imminent murder at Ashcroft Hall that preoccupied him, but the unsettling sense that this drama was far from over. Though the playwright's final act had been stopped, Holmes was convinced the script contained more than a single author's signature. There were lingering shadows within the manuscript, echoes of a mind older, more patient, more calculating. Late one afternoon, as rain drummed softly against the window panes of 221B, Holmes sat by the fire, the manuscript sprawled open before him. I was attending to my notes when a knock sounded at the door, followed by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade. Flushed and eager. "Holmes, I think you'll want to see this," he said, producing a folded sheet of paper. Holmes took the document without a word, reading swiftly. His eyes narrowed, fingers pressed to his temple. "A letter," he murmured, "from a watcher of shadows." Lestrade nodded grimly. "It was found slipped under the door of the yard this morning. The author has taken credit for the manuscript and warns that Arthur Crail was but a pawn." Holmes' expression hardened. So the true playwright remains at large, and they have grown impatient. He unfolded the letter carefully, reading aloud. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes and his associate, Dr. Watson, you have caught a marionette, but the puppeteer pulls many strings. The final act awaits, the one you least expect. Beware the locksmith who holds the key to silence. Time grows short, the curtain falls soon. Yours in shadow, a watcher of shadows." The words stirred something in Holmes. "The locksmith," I frowned. "You believe this refers to an actual person?" Holmes leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I do. And I suspect that locks here mean more than doors. Secrets, mechanisms, perhaps even codes." He turned abruptly. "Watson, this is no longer a matter of chasing scenes in a manuscript. It is a battle of minds, and the true villain has chosen the next move." We set out immediately to inquire at the Locksmiths' Guild in Holborn, a venerable establishment housing some of London's most skilled craftsmen, including locksmiths, safe-makers, and those employed in the highest levels of security. The guild master, a grizzled man named Thomas Hale, was wary at first, but soon revealed a recent curious visit from a man matching the description of our shadowy playwright. A man seeking an intricate mechanism capable of locking and unlocking multiple chambers without a key, and with a combination known only to the operator. "Fancy contraption, sir," Hale said. "Not the kind for the common thief. It was bespoke work. Someone with means and purpose." Holmes took notes swiftly. "Did he leave a name?" "No," Hale replied. only paid in cash and warned for discretion. As we left the guild, Holmes appeared contemplative, fingers drumming in irregular rhythm on the carriage door. Locks that open without keys, safes, cabinets, secret compartments. This suggests a place holding more than mere objects, perhaps knowledge, a secret that the playwright intends to guard or exploit. Returning to Baker Street, Holmes drew a detailed map of London's lesser-known archives and private collections, vaults that might house sensitive documents, manuscripts, or scandalous letters. He marked locations with care, circling several with particular emphasis: the old curiosity shop on Fleet Street, the abandoned warehouse in Rotherhithe, and, most intriguingly, the private vault of Sir Reginald Marchmont, a reclusive aristocrat rumored to possess incriminating letters from high society. We must consider, Holmes mused, that the playwright's final act is not merely a murder, but a revelation, something held in secrecy, unlocked at the cost of life. Days passed in a tense vigil. Then a letter arrived, stamped with Marchmont's family crest. Holmes read it aloud. "Dear Mr. Holmes, I write in grave concern. I believe my estate has been compromised. Strange noises and shadowy figures in the vaults below the manor have unsettled my staff. I fear a connection to the recent murders. Yours sincerely, Reginald Marchmont." We wasted no time. The carriage ride to Marchmont's estate was accompanied by Holmes's meticulous plans to corner the villain. Upon arrival, the manor was a fortress of stone and shadow, perched on the edge of the Thames like a sentinel. Sir Reginald greeted us with a wary eye and led us to the vault's entrance, a massive iron door with no visible lock. Holmes examined it carefully. "A mechanism hidden, no doubt," he murmured. Employing subtle techniques learned from his varied experiences, Holmes examined the wall panels and floorboards surrounding the vault. Then, producing a slender tool, he traced along a narrow groove invisible to the casual eye. With a soft click, the door swung open. Inside lay a cavernous room filled with shelves of leather-bound volumes, ornate chests, and sealed boxes. Sir Reginald's voice trembled. These contained correspondence and secrets long buried. Holmes's eyes glimmered with purpose. Secrets that some would kill to protect. We began examining the contents systematically, Holmes pausing before a curious wooden box. It bore a complex lock with no keyhole but several rotating discs etched with symbols. Holmes studied the lock intently. "This is no ordinary lock. It requires a sequence, likely known only to its creator." I watched as Holmes's fingers worked the discs, aligning symbols with patient precision. Suddenly, the lock clicked open. Inside the box lay a folded parchment, the final manuscript page. The writing was meticulous, the words chilling. "He who controls silence commands the stage. The locksmith, the guardian of the last secret, shall be the final victim. In death, he will release the truth he could not conceal." Holmes looked up sharply. "The villain intends to kill the locksmith. We have but hours to act." Sir Reginald nodded grimly. "There is but one locksmith here with access to these vaults, my trusted assistant, Jonathan Price." We found Price in the servants' quarters, a quiet man with a watchful gaze. Holmes explained the urgency. Price agreed to stay with us in the vault, keeping vigil over its secrets. Hours slipped by uneventfully until a faint creak echoed through the manor. Holmes motioned for silence as shadows moved near the vault's entrance. A figure cloaked in dark garments slipped inside. No mask, but a deliberate air of menace. Holmes stepped forward, voice calm but commanding. "You have no place here." The intruder paused, then lunged toward Price with a slender dagger. Price blocked the attack with a well-timed strike of his own. I sprang forward to help as Holmes seized the attacker's wrist, twisting until the blade clattered to the floor. The assailant's hood fell back, revealing a gaunt face and cold eyes. "A watcher of shadows," Holmes said quietly. "All or rather, the architect of this tragedy. As officers arrived to secure the intruder, Holmes approached. "Why?" I asked the man. "Why orchestrate such carnage through cryptic scripts and staged murders?" The man smiled, a thin, bitter curl of lips. "Because," he said, "in the shadows, truth is silent. Only through sacrifice does the world listen." Holmes shook his head slowly. "Your art is cruelty, and your stage is a charnel house." The final act was played out in the quiet halls of Marchmont's Manor, justice closing the curtain on a drama of obsession, pride, and fatal artistry. Later, in the quiet warmth of Baker Street, Holmes poured a final glass of wine. "Watson," he said, eyes distant yet clear, "there are those who write to be heard, and those who kill to be remembered. We have witnessed both." I nodded, the shadows of the case, lingering still. "But art," Holmes concluded softly, "must never demand blood for applause." And so ended the manuscript that predicted murder, an author's twisted script unraveled by the steady hand of reason and the keen eye of a detective who knew that in the theater of life every act must be met with truth, not tragedy. The arrest at Marchmont Manor was swift, but far from the conclusion I had hoped for. Though the man clasped in Holmes's grip confessed to being the elusive architect of the manuscript's grim sequence, the question of his motives and the unseen collaborators haunted the quiet hours that followed. Holmes himself appeared burdened, not by the weight of the capture, but by the fragments still unaccounted for in this twisted drama. We returned to Baker Street beneath a sky bruised with twilight, the lamps flickering alive in the streets like stars succumbing to fog. The manuscript lay sprawled across the desk, its pages now more a map of shadows than narrative. Holmes lit his pipe and settled into his favorite chair, eyes reflecting the fire's glow. "Watson," he said at length, "this case is an intricate web of deception and artistry, but it was never solely about the killings. The manuscript is the keystone, a confession and an accusation woven into one." I stirred the embers thoughtfully. "You believe our prisoner was part of a larger design?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Indeed. The playwright we apprehended, though cruel and cunning, was but a marionette himself. His handwriting, his stylistic peculiarities, they were consistent with the drafts, yes, but certain passages bear a more refined, deliberate hand, a master's touch." He tapped the manuscript. "I have traced the ink and paper provenance. The final chapters were penned on paper not available to Crail, nor to Dreve. Someone else provided the true climax and a certain signature, known only to a few." "Who, then?" Holmes folded his hands and looked past me toward the window, where the fog swirled like smoke from an unseen fire. "The name is concealed beneath layers of illusion, but the final chapter points toward a figure long believed retired, a locksmith not only of doors, but of secrets. A man with access to the deepest vaults of London's elite and the skill to silence those who threaten exposure." He reached into a drawer and produced a bundle of correspondence between a London magistrate and an anonymous informant. Among them was a letter describing a locksmith named Samuel Radcliffe, famed for his ingenious mechanisms and discretion, yet whispered about in certain circles for dealings of a far darker nature. "We must find Radcliffe," Holmes declared. The hunt for Radcliffe was slow but inexorable. We canvassed locksmith shops, spoke with guild members, and followed a trail of whispered rumors that led us to a modest workshop tucked away in a narrow street off Fleet Street. The sign above the door read simply, "Radcliffe and Sons, Locksmiths and Security." Inside, the air smelled of oil and metal. An elderly man greeted us with wary eyes beneath bushy brows. "Samuel Radcliffe?" Holmes inquired, his tone calm but commanding. The man nodded slowly. "That I am, and you are." "Friends," Holmes replied. "I understand you may have knowledge of certain documents and unfortunate events occurring recently." Radcliffe's expression hardened. "I am no murderer. but I do know of those who hide behind masks of words." Holmes leaned forward. "You have been linked to a manuscript, one that predicted murders, that orchestrated deaths in a theatrical sequence." Radcliffe's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "The manuscript is a folly of young men consumed by their own shadows. I helped with the locks, that is all." "But the letter signed Watcher of Shadows mentions you," I pressed, "the locksmith who holds the key to silence." Radcliffe sighed. "I am a craftsman, not a killer. But in these shadows, lines blur." He led us to the back room where a safe stood, heavily bolted. "This," he said, "contains secrets some would kill to keep." Holmes examined the safe. We found the lock, complex but not impenetrable. Radcliffe watched with folded arms. Holmes produced the slender tools he had kept from Marchmont's vault and began working the tumblers with masterful precision. Minutes later, the safe door swung open, revealing stacks of papers, letters, and photographs. Evidence of blackmail, political scandal, and debts owed to unseen masters. Holmes picked up a letter addressed to a member of Parliament. "Here is the true motive: power. Murder is but a tool for preservation." We spent hours poring over the contents. Among the documents was a draft of a final scene, one that implicated several influential figures in London's elite, promising exposure on the morrow. "It is no coincidence," Holmes said gravely, "that the manuscript predicted deaths among clergy, critics, and scholars. All threaten the delicate balance of power Radcliffe guards." Suddenly, a knock echoed. A messenger handed Holmes a note, no signature, but clear in purpose. "The final scene approaches. The locksmith's own locks will be tested. Prepare, or the silence will be eternal." Holmes's face was set like iron. "The Watcher dares a final gambit." He paced, fingers clasped behind his back. "We must anticipate the trap." The next evening, Holmes and I accompanied Radcliffe to a private reception at a mansion on the outskirts of London, an event that, according to the documents, would host many named in the manuscript. We arrived under the guise of guests, the halls adorned with flickering candles and the murmur of aristocratic voices. Holmes remained alert, observing every movement, every glance. The tension was palpable. At midnight, the gaslights dimmed, and a hush fell over the room. A figure stepped forward, cloaked, hooded, a presence that commanded silence. Holmes whispered, "The Watcher." The figure spoke with measured calm, revealing the manuscript in hand, reciting passages that condemned the powerful for their secrets and lies. Suddenly, a shadow darted forward, a struggle erupted, and gas filled the chamber. Panic surged as guests stumbled, coughing, grasping at the air. Holmes sprang into action, shouting orders as he and I fought to protect the host and the guests, using handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar to counter the poison. In the chaos, the Watcher vanished, leaving only whispered threats and a trail of fear. Afterward, Holmes gathered the survivors. "His message is clear," he said. "He will use silence as his weapon, but we will answer with truth." He turned to me. "The manuscript predicted murder, but it also foretold revelation. It is now our task to unveil the shadows behind the curtain." As dawn crept over London, the city stirred to a fragile calm. Holmes remained resolute, eyes shining with the fire of purpose. "Watson," he said softly, "the final act is upon us." And with that, our pursuit of the Watcher of Shadows pressed into its final, decisive hour. The chill of the early morning seeped through the windows of 221B Baker Street as Holmes and I gathered once more around the flickering fire, the embers casting long shadows that danced across the manuscript's worn pages. The events of the previous night lingered heavily upon us. An audacious performance by the Watcher of Shadows, a narrow escape from poisoned gas, and the unnerving realization that this final act was as much about spectacle as it was about death. Holmes had spent the night reviewing every fragment of the manuscript, every letter, every whispered clue, attempting to weave the disparate threads into a coherent tapestry. His gaze was sharp, his mind as restless as the fog that now blanketed London outside. "Watson," he began, voice steady but urgent. "The Watcher's game is far from over. We have been reacting to his moves, but it is time we take the initiative. The manuscript, with its precise timing and chilling predictability, is both a threat and a key. It reveals a pattern, an itinerary that we must decipher if we are to anticipate the next stroke." I leaned forward, the weight of his words pressing upon me. "What is your plan, Holmes?" He smiled briefly, the faintest flicker of triumph in his eyes. "We shall become actors on his stage, Watson. By controlling the narrative, we force the puppeteer's hand. The next scene, the final revelation, cannot unfold without an audience. We will be that audience, and the judges." Our first step was to secure the safety of those named in the manuscript. Holmes and I divided our efforts, coordinating with Inspector Lestrade to establish discreet but effective surveillance over the clergy, critics, scholars, and aristocrats implicated. The web of intrigue was vast, spanning the gilded halls of the elite to the shadowed alleys of the city. Holmes insisted on personally guarding Reverend Pendlebury, whose near murder and subsequent threats had marked him as a primary target. I accompanied him to the rectory under the guise of medical consultation, and we spent the day tracing the Reverend's movements and interactions. Though outwardly calm, the Reverend confessed to a growing dread, especially after receiving a final ominous note folded within his sermon notes. "Silence will fall where once voices preached." Meanwhile, Holmes engaged with Bellingham and Sir Reginald Marchmont, both under protection and clearly unsettled by the mounting menace. The network of fear was palpable. Every whispered conversation, every glance held a weight of suspicion and foreboding. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes unveiled the final piece of his deduction, a map he had meticulously compiled, plotting the times and locations associated with each planned murder, each sinister vignette drawn from the manuscript. The pattern was undeniable, a countdown converging upon a single moment and place. "The final act," Holmes mused, "is to be staged at the old clock tower on Fleet Street, the Watcher's own theatre of silence." The tower, long decommissioned and shrouded in myth, had been the site of countless secret meetings and clandestine affairs throughout London's history. It was an ominous choice for a denouement, its ticking heart silenced, yet somehow pulsing still beneath the layers of dust and darkness. Holmes and I prepared for the journey with deliberate care, equipped not only with lanterns and weapons, but with an unshakable resolve. Lestrade's men, though wary of Holmes's unorthodox methods, agreed to a coordinated approach, to surround the tower and close all exits, leaving the Watcher nowhere to flee. As we approached the tower, the fog thickened, swallowing the gaslight and muting the city's usual clamor. The massive iron door creaked ominously as Holmes pushed it open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase winding upward into the gloom. Step by step we ascended, the air growing colder and heavier with each turn. At the summit, a dim chamber awaited, its walls adorned with cryptic symbols, faded portraits, and an array of theatrical props scattered about as if a macabre rehearsal had taken place. In the center of the chamber stood a solitary figure cloaked in black, a mask concealing his features. The Watcher. Holmes stepped forward, voice calm yet resolute. "Your manuscript's pages have turned. The story ends here." The figure laughed softly, a sound like dry leaves rustling in a crypt. "Ah, Holmes, ever the detective, ever the meddler, but do you comprehend the play you seek to interrupt?" Holmes' eyes glinted. "Your murders have been acts of desperation, but also confession. You sought recognition, yet your victims never heard your name." "Recognition," the Watcher echoed. A cruel jest to vanish in the shadows when one craves the spotlight, but I will have my final scene. With a swift motion, he lunged toward a hidden panel, triggering a mechanism that began to seal the chamber. The air shifted. The watcher released a gas, thick and disorienting. I felt my senses dull, the chamber spinning as I fought to remain conscious. Holmes, however, reacted swiftly. He pulled from his coat a small mask soaked in ammonia, placing it over his mouth and urging me to do the same. The gas's effect lessened, and the watcher, seeing his plan foiled, cursed vehemently. Holmes seized the moment, rushing the figure and grappling him to the floor. The mask slipped, revealing a face twisted by years of obsession and scorn. "You," Holmes said quietly, "are the true author of the manuscript, the mastermind behind this tragic play." The watcher struggled, but Holmes's grip was unyielding. "Tell me your name," Holmes demanded. With a bitter smile, the man whispered, "Edmund Cartwright." The forgotten playwright, the rejected critic, the silenced voice. Holmes nodded grimly. "Your story ends, Cartwright. London will remember you not for your crimes, but for the justice you have evaded." As the police led Cartwright away, I looked back upon the chamber, the stage of so much pain and artifice. Holmes turned to me, exhaustion softened by the weight of victory. "In the theater of life, Watson," he said, "every shadow is cast by light. It is our task to find that light, no matter how faint." The manuscript was returned to the authorities, the victims' names cleared of suspicion, and the city breathed again, free from the grip of a watcher whose obsession had nearly rewritten fate. In the days that followed, Holmes resumed his habitual quietude, though a hint of satisfaction lingered in his eyes. As for me, I took comfort in the knowledge that, through intellect and perseverance, even the darkest scripts could be unraveled. And so, with the fog lifting over London's streets, our lives returned to their usual rhythms, ever ready for the next mystery to present itself. The heavy London fog had begun to lift, allowing pale shafts of morning light to pierce the gloom that had settled over the city for so many weeks. Yet the weight of what had transpired, the horrors, the cunning, the relentless pursuit, still hung in the quiet corners of Baker Street as Holmes and I sat before the dwindling embers of our hearth. The case of the manuscript that predicted murder was concluded, yet it left me pondering the nature of obsession and artistry, of genius turned to darkness. Holmes, ever the enigma, seemed at peace, but his eyes bore that familiar flicker of restlessness that presaged the next challenge. "Watson," he began, his voice low and reflective, "this affair has been unlike most. A murderer who scripts his crimes, an author who sought immortality through infamy. Yet in his downfall lies a lesson." I leaned forward, eager to hear his thoughts. "And what lesson might that be, Holmes?" "That brilliance, untethered by morality, becomes a peril not only to its creator, but to all within its reach. Cartwright's manuscripts were the shadows cast by his tortured mind, dark reflections that could have consumed us all." He paused, glancing toward the window where London was awakening, the streets slowly reclaiming their bustle. "But it also reminds us that reason and perseverance remain our greatest tools against chaos. It is by methodical inquiry, not fear, that we illuminate the darkest corners." I nodded, recalling the long nights spent piecing together the manuscript's cryptic clues, the painstaking unraveling of a web of deceit and tragedy. Holmes's genius had once again steered us to the truth, proving that intellect and patience could outmatch even the most sinister of designs. Holmes smiled faintly, the shadow of a smirk playing about his lips. "Of course, the human heart is a complicated stage, Watson. Even the keenest logic cannot always anticipate its follies." As he spoke, a servant entered with a letter bearing the seal of a prominent London newspaper. Holmes broke the wax and unfolded the page, scanning the headline, The Watcher unmasked, a city's nightmare ends. The article detailed the capture of Edmund Cartwright, the exposure of his crimes, and the revelation of the manuscript's true origins. Public opinion was a mixture of relief and morbid fascination, a city eager to turn the page. Holmes folded the paper carefully. It is as it should be. The truth laid bare, the shadows dispersed. He rose, stretching with a languid grace before turning to me. And now, Watson, our next case awaits. London streets are never silent for long. As the morning sun climbed higher, bathing Baker Street in gentle warmth, I felt a deep gratitude. For friendship, for justice served, and for the steady hand of the world's greatest detective. Together, Holmes and I stepped into the bustling city, ready to face whatever mysteries the day might bring. The end.